In this section, we're going to take a look at using the new Viewport Canvas tools to paint on meshes in 3ds Max. 2011 introduced a brand new painting tool where you can just paint directly on a model, and it's actually really pretty comprehensive. So let's try that out. You can see that we have this mesh here, and if we go into edge faces, that it's pretty low poly. And we're going to use this to paint on. We also have our normal map, so if you pop into the material editor, you'll see that the only map that this has is a normal bump map. I'm using a Wacom tablet for this section because whenever you're trying to paint any textures, it's probably a good idea. And one of the new features of Viewport Canvas is it has been Wacom enabled. So to paint on this mesh, we're just going to select it, and then we're going to go to Tools and choose Viewport Canvas. This is going to open up this dialog of tools, and you can see there's a bunch of hopefully fairly familiar tools like a paintbrush, clone, paint bucket, and things like that. We also have things for adjusting our brushes and viewing the 2D view and things of that nature. So the first thing I'm going to do is dock this over to the left so that it's a little bit easier to navigate in my interface. And then if I want to paint on anything, all you have to do is select it and then choose this paint button. What will happen is it will ask you basically what channel you want to paint on. And for us, we're going to choose the diffuse color. We're presented with a dialog that basically wants to know what size we want to make our first color and where we want to save the file to. So I'm going to say that we want it to be 2K, and this is just because actually I have some of those other maps like an AO map and other diffuse maps that I might want to blend in with what I'm painting, and I know that their resolution is 2K. You could set it to whatever you want. And we're going to tell it to save into this folder. You'll see that we have a couple other maps here that we may be making use of later, and our normal map is in here. We're just going to call this color.png, and it'll ask us what kind of ping we want to save out. And that's basically it. We can click on OK, and this is going to save out that map. And depending on what your preferences are, it'll bring up this little layers palette. You can get this layers dialog by just clicking this button and hide it as well. That's really one of the major improvements here in this latest tool is you have a full range of layers, blend modes, opacities, masks, and all sorts of other things that you can work with here, which is really pretty good. I definitely recommend that we take advantage of using these layers. So to get started, we can just paint right on this mesh. If you do paint, you're going to be painting on the background layer, which is something you might want to be aware of. So I'm just going to kind of zoom in here, and I'm going to start drawing. You can see because I have my Wacom tablet, I'm getting pressure sensitivity on all of these strokes. So they're, smaller, and I can really get, some pretty fine details. And the more I zoom in, the better the detail level of these paintings or of this will be. So I can just kind of sketch those really pretty easily. If I scroll down here into the tablet pressure, you can see that right now the brush radius and opacity is being controlled, and that's usually a good default. You can also control the scatter or hardness and uncheck these as you go. Now normally if I was working like this, I would probably scroll back up and let me just fill in some of this color. So we'll fill it with gray again. I'll bring up this little palette. You can have a little color palette here, and you can also load and save these out, which is pretty useful if you have some that you're using. And I'm just going to fill this a few times. So that we get back to a basic gray. And we can kind of see how that adds there. If I am going to work just, on that background layer, that's kind of one thing, but I really recommend adding different layers in. So let's click on Add New Layer, and you can see that we get this layer here, and we can choose whatever color that we want to start painting with. So let's explore some of the brushes and how this stuff works. So right now I'm actually able to see this little brush highlight, which is pretty helpful. depending on what you happen to be doing, and you can make, some pretty nice strokes with it. And the option for seeing this highlight is under brush settings in brush preview. You can see that if maybe you were zooming in and you really wanted to get those small strokes, then you may not want to have that brush preview on. Now, it is very useful if you're using any sort of brush images. You can see right now we're not, but we can use any sort of brush images. So there's a couple color presets and mask presets that come with it, and there's also custom maps. If we just go into Browse Custom Maps directory, you can see that I've added in, just by copying these files, a couple of skin files for skin color. And these are on the disk, so you can copy them into your Viewport Canvas custom brushes folder. And when you do that, and you click on Reload Custom Maps, you'll see them all show up there. So there's a few different textures here. If you don't want to do that, you can still use these basic color brushes. And we'll just make the brush size a little bit bigger. So we'll increase the radius over here. And you can see that we have kind of the display of this texture. So as I drag, I'm getting this texture painted on the character. So we'll just go through and kind of paint through. And we have all sorts of things like opacity. So we can adjust the opacity of this brush as well as, the pressure of that opacity. So this is kind of the max opacity that it will reach if we want to. And hardness as well as spacing. Let's just start to use a mask so we can look at some of the spacing. And I'll grab this abstract one in the middle. So now if we go over and let's just pick a different color. We'll pick a little bit of a darker color so we can kind of see that, and increase the opacity so that we can really see it on the mesh here. Okay, so now you can kind of see what's going to get drawn and how it gets drawn on the character, and where spacing might come into play. So any of these kind of stamp type masks, you may want to adjust the spacing so that you can kind of spread it out. And I think something like maybe 0.8 or 1 will be good for this one. And we can just kind of click and drag and get these details on the character. So that's a few basics on how to kind of load these up. As we build up more layers, so I might just undo that a few times. I'm hitting Control Z and add in a new layer. And this type of detail, I might go in and just kind of paint on the character. And you can see that even though it's a low poly character, we're getting, this is actually a paint or 2D projection onto the surface. So we're getting really pretty high detail on this, which is really great. So I'm just going in and painting this, and the versatility, of course, of working with layers is then I can go in and I can drop or bring up the opacity. I can choose different things like color burn, screen, or anything like that. So screen's, a good option just to kind of break up that texture that was underneath. And we have something like that. Now, as I'm kind of painting here, you see that we're painting on one side of the character's face. We also have the ability to go down into brush behavior and choose a mirror axis. So I'm just going to choose X, and now everything that I get painted on one side will paint on the other. So I can go back and kind of mess around with some of that stuff. So I'll just delete these two layers. We'll ask it not to use our mask, and we'll get that basic skin. I'm going to choose one of these skins that I have here and just kind of start painting just to rough out some color on both sides of this character. So I'm using a real simple skin texture that isn't really tileable, but because we have these fall offs and everything else, we're able to easily adjust where it goes on the character. I'll just zoom in a bit so that we can paint on here. And on the top of the head of the character. So this is a little blotchy up here. Depending on if we wanted to use a larger texture or a more tileable one or something like that, we can definitely do that. And we can also use some of these tools up here. So we have a blur as well as a smudge tool, and we can kind of blur those things out. And we can also do that on a kind of global basis. So I just want to take a quick look at a couple of the filters. We'll go over into this layer, which is actually the background layer, and just choose blur. And we can adjust how much we're going to blur this. So we'll blur it a little bit and say OK. Then we'll just go in and I'm going to paint over here. And to make your brush size larger, you can hold down Control Shift and then just click and drag, and that's going to increase your brush size. So if we wanted something that was much larger on this character, we could just lay down some pretty large brush prints. And that way on the top of the head, we won't get too much of that issue that we were seeing before. So I'm going to increase or add another layer to this. And I'll decrease that brush size, again holding down Control and Shift. And let's just hop back out to see how this looks with our normal map in rendering. So when we're done painting on this particular layer, we can just click on the brush again. And it's going to ask us where we want to save the texture. Now we have two layers here, and whatever we do on them, if we want it not to be flattened, we're going to have to save as a PSD. If we just flatten the layers and save it as a texture, it's just going to flatten everything down. The option I like to use in this case is save as PSD and replace texture and material. So basically it's going to make that PSD material, and it's also going to put it in and just save this out. So diff color.psd, and we'll pop out, we get our diffuse color, and we can kind of see how that works with our normal map on the character. I'm going to hop back in and do some more painting. And because we saved it out as a PSD, all of our layers and everything is all set up there, which is really pretty useful. Now, if I have some textures that I've made elsewhere or in Photoshop or wherever, then I can go and choose File, Load Bitmap into Current Layer. And that's what I'm going to do because I already have this AO file for the skull. So I'm going to choose this AO file. And I may want to blend that in with my diffuse color. So, I could take this and I can choose multiply. And that's going to add a lot of that texture in for the character, which is really pretty useful. And I can also use it as just a reference for, this is a pretty low poly mesh, and just as a reference for where I want to add details to the character in the diffuse color. So I'm going to add another layer here. And while I have these multiple layers, I'm just going to double click and rename this one AO. And then I'll go up here. So I want to add in some details around this character's eyes and teeth and things like that. So I'm keeping the symmetry on. And I'm going to go in here and rough out some details on this layer. I'll just bring my brush size down a little bit. And let's grab one of these, this kind of ugly skin texture in here. And I'm going to start kind of painting with that right in there. And this one is actually, it has a pretty large, if we just make the brush bigger, it has a pretty large like up and down type of texture that's going on. You can see it repeating there, which is okay. I'm just going to hit Control Z and make my brush size a little smaller. Again, Control Shift to do that. If I wanted to follow along, I'm going to choose Follow Stroke. And then what'll happen is as I'm stroking, that line will kind of follow along there, which is really pretty useful. So I'm still using that pressure sensitivity, and as I get bigger, this gets bigger there, which is pretty cool. And I'm just going to go in, make this a little larger, and add some detail in here. Okay, so I'm going to choose a different texture, maybe just one that's a little bit darker. And we'll use the mask as well. And just kind of go in between there and start roughing in some of that. I'm going to bring the spacing down a bit. And just painting some interesting details for this diffuse texture on the character. And while I'd like to use that mask, I'm going to ask it not to use the color and get something that's a little darker and kind of grimy and green to add in as well. Make my brush a little bit smaller and just going to zoom in a bit. There we go. And I can hide or unhide any of these layers to kind of see how they're interacting and play around with maybe making this screen or soft light to kind of blend it in with the texture. And then I'm going to go in to around the teeth here and just kind of do some of the same similar stuff here. I think maybe I'll make it a new layer. And I know that right around here I want it to be real kind of green and grimy. I'll zoom out a little bit. Now if I'm dealing with just like a regular color here, I can also choose to use some randomization. So when I go down here, you can see there's all sorts of randomization that you can use for just the brush radius and opacity. This is in addition to whatever you might have for your Wacom tablet. I'm going to choose color and just kind of randomize it to a different color. And that way, when I kind of paint, you can already see how the color changes. It adds a little bit of noise to what's kind of going on there. So I'm going to add that in. Just start to paint with some of this grime in here. Nothing like some grimy gums. And I'll change that color a bit. And maybe I'll experiment with using a different mask. So let's turn off this color. And I'm just going to get this mask here, which will give me kind of some speckled results. Decrease that spacing, that we get a bit more of this. And I'm going to turn off the mask and just go in with a color that would be kind of good for the teeth. We'll bring the overall opacity down a bit. Just kind of lay that stuff in there. Now, I'm zooming in quite a lot on the screen here, which is great. But if you want to actually see what's going on in the texture view, you can click on this 2D texture, and you can bring this up and you can paint right in the 2D texture view as well. So let me just bring this up here. I'm going to say 1 to 1. Maybe make this a little bit larger. And I can zoom and pan in here. And just start to mess around in this view. I can ask it to show the grid or not. And this will show all the layers that are present that I've painted on here. So if I want to have any of these up here and work on a layer, I can do that and I can just paint right in this view here, which is definitely pretty useful, especially if you want to do large things and something that would be across the entire character. For now, I'll just kind of play around in this view. And we'll zoom back out a bit. I'm going to set that to screen and maybe bring the opacity down a little bit, added a little bit of detail in there for that character's face, and we're going to hop back out. So let's just click there, and you can see that we can hop back out and play around here. So the next thing that I'm going to do is actually bring in another diffuse texture. So I'll hop back in here. We have all of our layers, and I'm going to make a new layer. Go to File, Load Bitmap into Current layer. And there's actually a painted diffuse layer here, so it's skull diffuse.tga. I'm going to open that in, and you can kind of see how this looks. So we can set this to anything that we want, or we can, so we can set it to screen so that we pick up some of the detail underneath, or we can put it anywhere in the stack that we want to, or even adjust our opacity up and down from it. I think it has some pretty good details, so I'm going to kind of choose to use this overlay here. And we can also set where we might want to see some of these details and where we might not want to. So let's just go to Layer and say Add Layer Mask, and we're going to say that we would like to hide all. And then as we're painting on that layer mask, we'll just paint with a white. It's going to reveal whatever's underneath. So we can go in and kind of paint that wherever we want to see any of these textures. So you can kind of layer these in. And as we do this, you can go into Filter, and you can choose a couple of different filters that you probably, pretty familiar with. High Pass, Blur, Sharpen. So we can say Blur. And basically we're blurring that mask there so that it blends a little bit more evenly with our character. I don't think I want to work with this mask right now, so I'm just going to go to either Disable or Delete Layer Mask. We'll say Disable for now. And I think, just setting it to Overlay will work for us. And let's go and paint on a different channel. So to do that, we're going to hop out. This is going to save everything. Now we have our normal map, our diffuse map, everything is in there for the character. And we're going to scroll down to Options, and you can see right now we're painting on the diffuse color. If we want to paint on a new color, basically once we've started painting, remember when we first started painting, we got the option of what to paint on. And once we've done that, it's going to just bring us back and forth as we've done a couple times. What you want to do is go into Options, and this will give you your options again. So if we want to go into something like the normal bump and paint in the additional bumps, we can do that. So for this, I'll just make it 1024, or actually we'll make it 2K so it matches, and we'll save this up as add bump. We're going to save out the PSD afterwards, so it's probably not going to matter so much what we save it out. This is just for giving it a directory to work with. Then we'll say OK. And it's going to bring us to here where we can see, our diffuse as well as our bump map, because we'll be painting on that additional bump map now. So now we can go in and just use black and white. So I'll set this to white, and we'll use this mask here. And we can start painting on this character. So actually, why don't we go ahead and we'll fill with black. Or I guess it'd be better to fill with white. We can go into the 2D view and just fill it a few times so that it's a little whiter. And then we'll paint with black. So this is just adding in a little bit more bump detail of whatever it is that you want. We can choose different masks here. So I'm going to choose this mask right here, and we'll increase the spacing. Give us some interesting detail on the character. Bring that in there. We can blend that together. And this will just be added to the additional bump channel. go in and add some of these guys to make that brush a little bit bigger. Blending in some detail there. And then we'll hop out. And this is going to get added there. So now you can see that in our additional bump channel, we have all that detail that we painted in. We want to just kind of bring that detail level down so that it's not quite as bumpy. So we can just go into the material and adjust that. So we'll hop in. Go in a bump, and you can see an additional bump. We have that there. So maybe we'll bring that down half as much and see if that'll work out well for us. So it's much more tame, and we've been able to add in some more details to the normal map that we painted on. So that's pretty much how to use the new Viewport Canvas tools in 3ds Max 2011. I find them hugely useful. It's a great leap forward in texturing and painting right in the viewport in Max. And there's a lot of great options in here to explore and use. I think it's a super tool for texturing characters as well as objects in your scene. Thank you very much.